The period from 1935 to 1940 marked a critical era in the history of international relations, particularly concerning the aggressive actions of Italy under Mussolini. Following Italy's invasion of Abyssinia in 1935, the world witnessed a significant test of the League of Nations' effectiveness. This era was characterized by a complex interplay of diplomatic maneuvering, appeasement policies, and the rising tide of fascism in Europe. The responses from major powers, notably Britain and France, revealed that they were hesitant to confront anyone aggressively. They were driven by their national interest and a desire to avoid another devastating conflict like World War I. As the League of Nations struggled to uphold its principles in the face of Italian expansionism, this failure to unify against such aggression not only emboldened Mussolini, but also set the stage for broader conflicts that would engulf Europe in the years to come. This examination of the international response to Italian aggression sheds light on the challenges faced by democracies in the interwar period and highlights the consequences of their decisions on the unfolding geopolitical landscape. The policy of appeasement was a diplomatic strategy employed primarily by Britain in the 1930s that aimed to maintain peace by making concessions to aggressive powers, primarily Nazi Germany and Fascist Italy. This approach was rooted in a desire to avoid another devastating conflict following the horrors of World War I, as well as a belief that some of the grievances held by dictators were legitimate and could be addressed through negotiation. British leaders, notably Prime Minister Neville Chamberlain, hoped that by allowing Hitler to annex territories such as the Sudetenland in Czechoslovakia and the remilitarization of the Rhineland, they could satisfy his ambitions and prevent further aggression. The strategy was also influenced by widespread public sentiment against war, economic constraints stemming from the Great Depression, and the belief that strong military action against Germany was not feasible at the time. Ultimately, the policy of appeasement revealed the weaknesses in international responses to aggression and contributed to the conditions that led to World War II. Appeasement, in this political and historical context, was a diplomatic policy of making concessions to nations in order to avoid conflict. The policy is most closely associated with Britain's foreign policy in the late 1930s, in particular the Munich crisis of 1938. Appeasement failed to prevent the outbreak of war and came to be seen as a weak and dishonorable policy. It allowed both Mussolini and Hitler to get away with territorial demands, which encouraged Hitler to ask continuously for more, resulting in the outbreak of war in 1939. However, for most of the interwar years, appeasement was seen as a positive idea and as a part of a long-standing tradition of trying to settle disputes peacefully. As you can see, there were some people that were anti-appeasement. The Foreign Secretary of Great Britain, Anthony Eden, resigned because he disagreed with Chamberlain so much. He was also the Secretary of State of War. Winston Churchill was certainly very much opposed to appeasement. He once claimed to be the only person that ever read Mein Kampf. And then, of course, we've seen plenty of David Lowe's cartoons in which you can tell that he was anti-appeasement as well. The Franchise Act of 1918 significantly increased the number of voters in Britain from 8 million to 21 million, allowing women over the age of 30 to vote, and later lowering the age to 21 in 1928. This expansion of the electorate made politicians more responsive to public opinion, which was largely against war and in favor of collective security. Many conservative politicians viewed the threat of communism as more dangerous than fascism, contributing to widespread support for appeasement across all political parties, with no clear anti-appeasement alternative available. Economic pressures also influenced this policy. Britain was still recovering from the devastation of World War I, and the Great Depression made economic difficulties more abundant, leading to high unemployment rates. The public was concerned about the cost of rearmament and the potential for a balance of payments crisis if spending increased too rapidly. The horrors of World War I have created a strong anti-war sentiment, exemplified by Oxford's Union's 1933 vote against fighting for king and country. Events like the bombing of Guernica in 1937 heightened fears of civilian casualties in Britain, leading to a belief in the League of Nations as a means to maintain peace. Many British politicians felt that the Treaty of Versailles had been overly punitive and that Hitler had legitimate grievances, which fostered a belief that diplomatic solutions with leaders like Mussolini and Hitler were possible, further reinforcing the policy of appeasement. By 1937, Britain found itself in a weak military position, facing threats from Japan, Italy, and Germany. The British Chiefs of Staff concluded that the primary aim of foreign policy should be to reduce the number of enemies. This was emphasized in a statement from January 1938, which acknowledged the difficulty of safeguarding British interests against all three powers simultaneously. Alongside European obligations, Britain had to consider its global commitments, as many politicians believed that British interests extended beyond Europe. The preservation of the empire was deemed essential for maintaining Britain's status as a great world power, although managing its vast imperial commitments became increasingly challenging. Additionally, at the 1937 Imperial Conference, the domains, including Canada and Australia, made it clear that they were unwilling to support Britain in another European war. Financial pressures further complicated matters, with the Treasury prioritizing defense expenditures to prepare for air attacks, preserve trade routes, and defend the empire before aiding allies. When Neville Chamberlain became Prime Minister in 1937, these financial constraints and imperial commitments left him little choice but to pursue a policy of conciliation rather than confrontation with Germany and Italy. Chamberlain personally detested war and aimed to resolve international tensions through negotiation and diplomacy. He managed foreign policy largely alone, relying on his chief advisor, Sir Horace Wilson, while sidelining his cabinet. He had little faith in the League of Nations or Britain's allies. He distrusted the Soviet Union, and he believed that Britain should lead negotiations with Hitler. Right up until the outbreak of war, Chamberlain remained hopeful of achieving a general settlement in Europe to maintain peace. France had a fundamentally different perspective on Germany in the Treaty of Versailles compared to Britain, and was not inclined to adopt a policy of appeasement during the 1920s. After World War I, France faced significant debts and economic hardship, as about 10% of its land had been devastating, impacting both industrial and agricultural resources. The immense loss of life and trauma caused by previous invasions fueled the French desire to punish Germany and prevent any resurgence. The absence of U.S. support, highlighted by its failure to ratify the Treaty of Versailles and join the League of Nations, left France feeling abandoned. Additionally, Britain's growing sympathy towards Germany's treatment at Versailles further disheartened the French. During the 1920s, France sought to bolster its position by forming alliances with several countries, resulting in the Little Entente with Czechoslovakia, Romania, and Yugoslavia. However, the political instability and frequent changes in government during the 1930s hindered France's ability to take decisive action against Germany. Economic issues compounded by the Great Depression led to stagnation, high unemployment, and the rise of right-wing movements. In response, left-wing parties united to form the Popular Front, which won a significant victory in 1936 under Prime Minister Leon Blum. Blum's government faced criticism for prioritizing domestic reforms over rearmament. By May 1938, Daladier returned as prime minister, advocating for increased military spending, but ongoing government instability led to inconsistency in France's approach to Hitler. There's also a conflict between France's foreign policy commitments and its military planning. Despite guarantees to Eastern European states requiring offensive capability, French military strategy in the 1930s was largely defensive, exemplified by the construction of the Maginot Line. Ultimately, France's ineffective air force and limited army made it increasingly dependent on Britain. And as Britain opted for a policy of appeasement, France had to align its stance accordingly. The international response to acts of expansion and aggression in the 1930s should have been managed through the League of Nations, which was intended to facilitate collective security. However, the League faced significant limitations that undermined its effectiveness. It lacked the credibility and economic power of its founding nation, the United States, which did not join the League. Its key decision-making body, the Council, was dominated by Britain, France, Italy, and Japan, with Germany joining in 1926. Notably, Italy and Japan were revisionist powers seeking to alter the Treaty of Versailles. The Soviet Union did not become a member until September 1934, and the League's structure was often inefficient. As a result, it proved weak against aggressive fascist states, and with each failure to act effectively, it lost further authority. Lacking the economic and diplomatic backing of the United States, it fell to Britain and France to enforce the League's resolutions. However, Britain prioritized its own interest, while France had little faith in the League's capability to contain the threats posed by Mussolini's Italy or Hitler's Germany. The United States did not join the League of Nations in 1919 and pursued a policy of isolationism during the interwar period, aiming to engage in global trade and investment while avoiding conflicts that did not serve its interests. This isolationist stance continued throughout the 1930s, bolstered by the Great Depression and strong public opinion that was firmly anti-war. Fresh memories of the First World War influenced American sentiments, leading isolationists to advocate for non-involvement in both European and Asian affairs. In 1935, the U.S. enacted the Neutrality Act, which was designed to keep the country out of potential European conflicts by prohibiting the sale of arms to belligerent nations. Western hostility towards the Soviet Union significantly influenced its response to Italian and German aggression. After the Bolshevik Revolution in 1917, Western democracies severed diplomatic and economic ties with the new Soviet government and even invaded Russia in an attempt to overthrow it. This invasion failed and the USSR was excluded from the Paris peace talks, leading Vladimir Lenin to denounce the League of Nations as a band of robbers. Relations remained tense until the late 1920s when some diplomatic links and economic agreements were reestablished. However, Britain was very weary of the communist threat. And after a Red Scare in 1927, it did not restore diplomatic relations until the 1930s. Under Stalin, the Soviet Union pursued a policy of socialism in one country, delaying any commitment to exporting revolution until domestic processes were complete. Nevertheless, the activity of the Communist International alarmed Western democracies. Stalin's foreign policy began to shift as the Soviet Union faced threats from Japanese expansion in Asia and Hitler's ambitions in Eastern Europe. Between 1931 and 1932, Stalin signed non-aggression pacts with several countries, marking a shift toward a popular front against fascism. The Soviet Union joined the League of Nations in 1934 and signed mutual assistance pacts with France and Czechoslovakia in 1935. However, the goal of forming a united front against fascism faltered due to Britain and France's policy of appeasement. The Spanish Civil War further revealed that Britain feared communism more than fascism. The final catalyst for the Soviet Union to abandon cooperation with Britain and France occurred at the Munich Conference in September of 1938, where Stalin, despite having an assistant pact with Czechoslovakia, was not invited, highlighting the exclusion of the USSR from significant discussions regarding European security. Both the French and the British sought to keep Mussolini aligned as a key guarantor of the post-war settlement, particularly to contain German ambitions regarding Austria. In March 1935, the three nations formed the Stresa Front, during which the French gave Mussolini the impression that they would tolerate Italian expansionism in East Africa. French foreign minister even suggested that Italy could acquire political influence in Abyssinia, as French interests there were primarily economic. Although France did not endorse a military takeover, Mussolini believed they would not oppose his plans. Britain remained silent on the issue during the Stresa Conference, leading Mussolini to hope for similar leniency from Britain. However, the Italians were cautious of Britain's potential response, particularly regarding threats to attack with the Italian Navy. Britain Foreign Secretary Anthony Eden's visit to Rome in June 1935 aimed to appease Italian expansion by offering the Ogaden region of Abyssinia to Italy while compensating Emperor Salici with access to sea via British Somaliland. The Italians rejected this plan, believing Britain intended to accommodate their ambitions, a sentiment reinforced by a report indicating Britain would not resist an Italian invasion of Abyssinia. When Mussolini invaded Abyssinia in October 1935, it sparked widespread international outrage and condemnation from the League of Nations, with British public opinion strongly opposing the invasion and favoring League action. This public sentiment was particularly significant in light of the upcoming general election in November 1935, as a pro-League stance had aided the national government's victory. However, as subsequent events revealed, the League proved ineffective in addressing this crisis. On December 6, 1935, following the Walwal incident, Abyssinian Emperor Salici appealed to the League of Nations for arbitration. However, the League's arbitration committee found neither side responsible. On January 7, 1935, a Franco-Italian agreement was made in France. In exchange for Italian support against Hitler, granted Italy parts of French Somaliland and improved the status of Italians in Tunisia, effectively allowing Mussolini to act freely in Abyssinia. After a significant buildup of Italian forces in East Africa, Emperor Salici again appealed to the League for support on March 17, 1935, and continued to seek assistance as the situation escalated, including another appeal on May 11th. A special session of the League was held on May 20th to discuss the crisis, and on June 19th, Salici requested that the League observers be sent to the region, but talks between Italian and Abyssinia officials broke down at The Hague. Despite Anglo-French efforts to appease Mussolini and British attempts through Anthony Eden to find a peaceful resolution, it became clear by early July that Italy was pursuing a war of conquest. On July 25th, the British declared an arms embargo on both sides, partly in response to Mussolini's warning that arms sales to Abyssinia would be seen as unfriendly, and subsequently withdrew their warships from the Mediterranean, allowing Mussolini to freely supply his forces in East Africa. By the end of September, Salici again requested neutral observers while beginning to mobilize his outdated army. Without a formal declaration of war, Italian forces invaded Abyssinia on October 3rd. The League recognized Italy as the aggressor on October 7th and began to impose sanctions. However, these sanctions were slow to implement and did not cover key war materials such as coal, steel, and oil. The British government was hesitant to impose harsh sanctions due to its desire to maintain the Stresa Front and good relations with Mussolini, even as they faced pressure to uphold the League's authority. Notably, Britain chose not to close the Suez Canal, a crucial supply route for Italian forces. Many countries, including Austria, Hungary, and Nazi Germany, ignored the sanctions, while the U.S. actually increased exports to Italy. Consequently, the sanctions proved largely ineffective, as they always are, by the way, in hindering the Italian war effort and even bolstered domestic support for Mussolini, with the League failing to take further action despite the use of chemical weapons in Abyssinia. In their effort to maintain the Stresa front against a resurgent Germany, the French and British devised an appeasing plan to resolve the conflict over Abyssinia. In December 1935, French Foreign Secretary Pierre Laval and British Foreign Secretary Samuel Hoare proposed the Hoare-Laval Pact, which aimed to appease Mussolini by granting him most of Abyssinia while allowing Emperor Salici access to the sea. However, the plan was leaked to the French press, leading to widespread outrage among the public in both Britain and France over the perceived duplicity of their governments. As a result, there was a strong demand for adherence to the League of Nations policies, forcing the British and French governments to denounce the pact and continue sanctions against Italy. The fallout from the scandal ultimately led to the resignations of both of the foreign secretaries. The Hoare-Laval Pact effectively sealed the fate of the League of Nations in 1935, exposing it as a sham and leading to a shift in focus for Britain and France away from East Africa and towards Europe when Hitler remilitarized the Rhineland in March 1936. France was willing to allow Mussolini to complete his conquest of Abyssinia in exchange for his support against Hitler, and thus they refrained from endorsing further sanctions. On May 2nd, Emperor Salici fled, and the capital fell to Italian forces. But there was no official surrender, and guerrilla war against the Italians persisted. Salici made an urgent appeal for support from the League, and on June 30th, despite facing ridicule from Italian journalists, he delivered a powerful speech condemning the international community for its inaction and proposed a resolution to deny recognition of Italian conquest, warning, "It is us today, it will be you tomorrow." Despite his impassioned plea, the resolution failed, and on July 4th, the League voted to end its sanctions, officially lifting them on July 15th. The newly established Italian Empire received recognition from Japan on November 18, 1936, in exchange for recognizing Japan's occupation of Manchuria. By 1938, Britain and France had also recognized Italian control of Abyssinia, although the U.S. and the USSR refused to acknowledge the legitimacy of the Italian Empire. The international response to the Abyssinian crisis significantly impacted European diplomacy, fatally undermining the League of Nations as a credible authority for addressing aggressor states and effectively ending the Stresa front. In the aftermath of this conflict, both France and Britain concluded that appeasement was the only viable strategy to prevent war with Hitler's Germany, thereby shifting the balance of power in favor of Germany. Consequently, Mussolini began to move towards a full alliance with Hitler, solidifying the growing Axis powers and altering the geopolitical landscape in Europe. On August 18, 1935, President Roosevelt sent Mussolini a personal message expressing the belief that failing to achieve a peace settlement in East Africa would be a problem with negative repercussions for all nations. However, the United States clarified that it would not take any direct action regarding the situations, as said by Secretary of State Hull in a radio address on November 6, 1935. In this broadcast, Hull emphasized that it was the U.S. duty to remain aloof from disputes and conflicts that did not directly concern the country, reinforcing the isolationist stance that characterized American foreign policy during this period. The appeasement of Mussolini's Italy came to a decisive end in the 1930s as the aggressive actions of Italy increasingly challenged the resolve of Western democracies. Initially, Britain and France tolerated Mussolini's expansionist ambitions in the hope of maintaining peace and containing the threat of Nazi Germany. However, the Italian invasion of Abyssinia in 1935, coupled with the League of Nations' ineffectiveness in responding to this aggression, began to shift public opinion and political attitudes in Britain and France. The Hoare-Laval Pact was aimed at to appease Mussolini by granting him significant control over Abyssinia, but it backfired, leading to outrage and a call for a firmer stance against Italian expansion. As World War II loomed closer, the realization that appeasement had failed to curb Mussolini's ambitions prompted a reassessment of foreign policy. By 1940, with Italy's alignment with Nazi Germany and its increasing military aggression, the policy of appeasement was abandoned, paving the way for a more confrontational approach from Britain and its allies as they sought to address the threats posed by both Mussolini and Hitler. Great Britain, alongside France, condemned Italy's invasion of Albania, marking a significant turning point for Prime Minister Chamberlain, who had previously trusted the dictators in their guarantees regarding the sovereignty of the Balkans. This shift in perspective led Chamberlain to guarantee Greek borders with British military support, reflecting his growing distrust of the aggressive actions of Mussolini and Hitler. With Churchill advocated for a more direct response, including deploying the Royal Navy, Chamberlain opted for a more cautious approach. Mussolini, however, was taken aback by the appeaser's commitment to Greece, indicating a potential miscalculation on his part regarding the resolve of Western democracies in the face of his expansionist ambitions. When Italy entered World War II in June 1940, Mussolini's forces invaded Egypt and Greece from Albania. In response, the British launched Operation Compass, counterattacking Italian forces in North Africa and successfully pushing them out of Egypt, culminating in their defeat at Beta in Libya in February 1941. The British Navy, previously feared by the Italian Navy, dealt a significant blow by sinking half of the Italian fleet at the harbor of Taranto on November 11, 1940. Following this, British forces occupied Crete, marking a series of initial military successes. However, the tide turned when German forces arrived to support Italy, leading to the British evacuation of Greece in May 1941. By June 1942, the British had been pushed back to Al Alamein in Egypt, illustrating the shifting dynamics of the conflict in North Africa. The international response to Italian aggression from 1935 to 1940 highlighted the failures of collective security and the limitations of the League of Nations. Despite initial condemnations and attempts to enforce sanctions following Italy's invasion of Abyssinia, the lack of unity and commitment among the major powers ultimately undermined these efforts. Britain and France's appeasement policies, motivated by their own national interest and economic concerns, allowed Mussolini to pursue his expansionist ambitions with relative problems. The Hoare-Laval Pact further eroded confidence in the League and revealed the duplicity of Western powers, which only fueled further aggression. As the situation evolved, the response to Italian actions served as a precursor to the broader conflict of World War II, illustrating how unchecked aggression could lead to greater instability in Europe. The failure to effectively confront Italy's expansionism not only emboldened Mussolini, but also set a dangerous precedent for future aggressors, demonstrating the challenges of maintaining peace in a time of rising totalitarian regimes.